Welcome to Econ 102, where economist Noah Smith and I make sense of what's happening in the news, technology, business, and beyond through the lens of economics. Let's jump right in. Dude, thanks for doing this on a Sunday.
Absolutely.
Excited to do this. There's a few pieces you wrote. I wanted to start with the developing economies one and look at Argentina, because let's reflect a little bit on Milei. What do you think that you had an opinion originally, and sort of how things have played out? What is your sort of assessment, based on what's
Honestly, I
happened?
didn't have a lot of preconceptions about what I thought was going to happen there because I don't understand, or at least I didn't. I read a whole bunch about it recently, but I don't think I understood Argentina's background situation, recent situation, and Malay's sort of pledges and promises enough to really make a good prediction. Nor did I understand its politics enough to know what he would be able to get through and what he wouldn't. So Malay had one prominent idea that it was obviously bad, which was to replace the local currency with dollars and actually have people use dollars. And so the idea behind this was to take away the central bank's ability to inflate. And so as soon as the central bank knew that people were just using dollars and wouldn't use whatever currency it made, they would stop printing money and be sort of chastened into like no longer basically funding government deficits. And the central bank would be forced to be a hard money central bank. And so this is what a lot of gold standard people have in their minds when they think about going back to the gold standard. They think the Fed wouldn't be able to like print a bunch of money because it has to be linked to gold, et cetera. It was a bad idea. First of all, you should never use another country's currency as your local currency, because if you run out of it, you're in big trouble, right? It's like, imagine America gets to decide whether you're able to pay for things because you can't, so like that's bad. So it was a bad idea, but it was also politically probably impossible and was just done as a sort of aggressive move to sort of really threaten everybody and say, look, guys, I'm going to do it. One way or another, inflation is going to get stopped. But what he actually did primarily was fiscal austerity. And he did some currency stuff, but I'm not sure exactly how important that was. I think the fiscal austerity was very important. So they basically cut all across the board, ton of things. Someone from Argentina once described it to me as a middle income country that has a upper income welfare state. So they're trying to give people the same lifestyle that they'd enjoy in Denmark with half the income of Denmark, or less than half the income of Denmark, right? So you just can't afford it. And so they just keep running these chronic deficits, and the chronic deficits lead to inflation, and they lead to, periodic economic collapses and external borrowing and external defaults and all these kind of things that you get when developing countries sort of like do too much, right? They borrow too much, et cetera, et cetera. And so, anyway, so he came in doing austerity, and basically like that fixed that for the moment.
Got it. And one thing you were preaching was evolution, not revolution. But Malay's 31% spending cut, shock therapy, seems to have worked to some degree. Does it prove that sometimes extremism is needed to break dysfunctional systems?
I don't know, because I don't think that was extremism.
Got it.
Just standard fiscal, like tightening, belt tightening, austerity measures. I don't see that as an extreme thing. You haven't overthrown the government. You haven't fundamentally changed the way anything works. You haven't overthrown Congress. You haven't overthrown the courts. You haven't changed the way that economic policy works in your country. All you've done is do a fiscal adjustment within the bounds of what your rules allow. So it's not revolutionary to me.
Got it. And yeah, interesting. And so when we think about sort of industrial policy for strategic sectors, we talk about that. At the same time, there seems to be something to celebrate with Malay's deregulation. How do we decide when countries need intervention versus sort of let the market play out?
The question is the economy getting you what you need? And if not, why not? So, for example, in the United States, our economy has been doing a good job at raising the income of the average American. And a lot of people think this is not true. A lot of people, Bernie Sanders will tell you that the average person's wages have gone down since the 1970s. Well, that's not even remotely close to true. It's gone way up. Incomes have gone way up. And they haven't gone up as much as we like because of inequality, right? Too much of the gains have flowed to the rich, in my opinion. But that doesn't mean there's been no gains for the middle class. The middle class in America is quite a bit richer than they used to be in like 1980, let's say, or 1973, if you want to go back that far. But then certainly, look at the Reagan years. People lived with a kind of daily scarcity of like having to watch how much they turn the lights on in their house, having to watch how much they ran the heater and the air conditioner, having to watch how much food they bought, having to watch how much they drove the car. And people lived with a daily scarcity. I can't really remember very well, but then, but I remember like 1990 or so when I was a little kid. I do remember that kind of stuff. I remember people still living, these, my family was not poor. We were not poor people, but we lived constantly conscious of like saving little bits of money and things like that. There was a scarcity mindset that I don't see as much today. You look at the income numbers and the wealth numbers, et cetera, everything's just so much better than it was at that time. And so basically all the complaints of like America is poorer than we used to be are wrong. Right. And by the 90s, people, women were working. So it's not just that we went to two income households. Like you look at wages, you look at individual personal wages, incomes, they've gone up. So I'm not a fan of the idea that we need industrial policy to make us wealthier. We are wealthy and we've been getting wealthier. Maybe we need some more like redistribution or, things like that, but to make sure the middle class gets a larger share of the benefits or the poor get a larger share of the benefits. But we don't need a fundamental overhaul of the system. It's making us very rich. However, what we do have is a sort of a security gap. So China threatens us a lot because it threatens to dominate strategic industries and be able to then push us around as a country, at which point China will then try to impoverish us. If they get that power to do that, they will do that to make sure we're never a rival to them again. I think that the market does not naturally provide national defense, nor does it necessarily provide enough of the right industries that could be repurposed for national defense in a pinch. So when you had World War II, you had the government basically calling up Ford and all these private companies that normally serve the private sector at large scale and saying, Ford, make us tanks, make us bombers, make us all these things. And they said that to every company. Every civilian company became a defense contractor. And this is why America was able to outproduce the rest of the world in World War II. And this is why we were able to win it. And this is also why we were able to sort of cow the Soviet Union into submission, because we were the people who made all the stuff, And so in any protracted war, we could make all the stuff. They could use nukes, but then they died too. Right? So we had escalation dominance over them because we were the arsenal of democracy. But now China's that. They're doing that to us. And we're in big trouble and we need to do better. And the market alone is not going to do that for us. That doesn't mean we need to throw out the market, become a command economy. Obviously, becoming the Soviet Union wouldn't help. But intervening in the market in ways that allow us to maintain a robust defense is justified, in my opinion.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, related to this, I'm curious if you think that, because one thing you wrote about was that the ideal development policy makes hinges on where you start. And so, what decision framework should leaders use to pick free market solutions versus steady state support based on their current economics health?
Well, it just look around and see what problems you have, and then that will tell you what you have too much of. So if you have way too much inequality in your country, you're like, oh, we should redistribute more, and also not just redistribute more, but also put more money, put a lot of government services into increasing the economic opportunities for the lower classes. And this is what Latin America has generally done since 2000. You've seen in Latin America, inequality has gone down across the board, both in self-described socialist countries, but also in capitalist countries. In every country in Latin America, inequality has been going down, and redistribution is part of it. Part of it is increased money toward educating the poor, and working class people so that they can have better skills, make more money in the market for themselves. And so they really put a lot of effort toward reducing inequality, and it's been working, right? But if you're Japan, slow growth is really a problem, and you need to do policies to speed up growth. This is boring. This is not sexy. This is not revolutionary. This is not something you can wait. You can, if you go to flag and protest and wave around a flag that says like, do economic policies that work, then like, okay, cool. Yay. But if you're an elite, if you're a policymaker, this is how you should be thinking. You should be thinking, we've got to do what works. What's our problem? Where are we falling short? And America is falling short in not just in national defense, but also in a second area, which is our ability to provide some of the basic necessities for normal people. So even though overall incomes are great, you can buy a lot of, TVs and phones and stuff and food and whatever. Our healthcare and our housing has not gotten more expensive overall, but housing near desirable locations where you'd want to live, like San Francisco, has gotten much more expensive. And healthcare has gotten more expensive. Daycare, childcare has gotten more expensive. College got more expensive too. And so most of these are starting to reverse, except for childcare. These are starting to reverse. Healthcare as a percent of GDP has been going slightly down, actually. As it looks like it's hit a plateau. Housing costs are slightly lagging wages, even though not by as much as we like. We'd like housing to be even cheaper. Housing in expensive cities, some expensive cities, seems to have plateaued in some sense, like housing costs. And also saying, college is getting cheaper.
Hmm.
Not even factoring in financial aid, but just headline tuition is getting cheaper and cheaper because demand for college is going down. And so this is good. This is a good trend, but it's got a long way to go. And so we need to provide stuff abundantly and cheaply. And this is where abundance comes in, right? Also, electricity prices have been creeping up for various reasons. And building like a ton of solar power and batteries is the way to bring those prices down. But our system makes it hard to build things.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned inequality a few times. How do we know when a country has too much inequality? Or like, obviously it's an opinion, but what is your perspective on sort of that a healthy amount of, like, when does it get too much?
Well, when people start getting really mad, it starts causing political instability. I think that, once people get mad, and you don't want them to bring out the rakes and pitchforks, you don't want them to start burning things down. That's not good for the economy. It's not good for anybody. So the purpose of reducing inequality in terms of like the proximate purpose, I mean, the overall purpose is because, like we don't want people to be poor. Like if you have $1 in the hands of Elon Musk, it's going to bring less happiness to the world than $1 in the hands of some poor people, right?
Right.
Or let's say instead of $1 in the hands, because Elon Musk will invest it, but let's say that Elon Musk consumes a cheeseburger, that's going to make the world less better off than a poor person consumes a cheeseburger, right? So increasing the consumption of the poor in terms of giving them high quality housing, access to high quality healthcare, and all these things like that, that increases the welfare of the world a lot, whereas rich people already have most of the stuff they need.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Founders and startup leaders, if you'd rather grow your business than wrangle a bunch of equity spreadsheets this summer, listen up. You probably know Carta, the platform that more than 50,000 startups use to fundraise faster, plan and issue equity, and keep ownership data up to date and investor ready. Right now, Carta is running a killer summer offer, up to 40% off your first year of a new Carta plan, including cap table management, so you can spend less time managing equity and more time shaping the future of your business. With this offer, you can also add on Carta's QSBS attestation service, which could help you and your shareholders keep more of what you build, thanks to Carta's expertise in navigating capital gains tax breaks. And Carta Total Compensation, which gives you access to private market benchmarks to help you forecast how much cash and equity to give your team. Carta hardly ever runs deals like this, and this one's only good through the end of the month. So if you've been looking for a more scalable way to manage your cap table, equity tax planning, comp strategy, and more, it's time to get out of spreadsheets and into Carta. You can take advantage of this limited time offer and save up to 40% on your Carta plan by going to z.carta.com/econ102. Terms and conditions apply. That's z.carta.com/econ102. It's an interesting time for business. Tariff and trade policies are dynamic, supply chains squeezed, and cash flow tighter than ever. If your business can't adapt in real time, you're in a world of hurt. You need total visibility, from global shipments to tariff impacts to real-time cash flow. That's NetSuite by Oracle, your AI-powered business management suite, trusted by over 42,000 businesses. NetSuite is the #1 cloud ERP for many reasons. It brings accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one suite. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. And with AI embedded throughout, you can automate a lot of those everyday tasks, letting your team stay strategic. NetSuite helps you know what's stuck, what it's costing you, and how to pivot fast. If I had needed this product, it's what I'd use. It's one system, full control. Tame the chaos with NetSuite. If your revenues are at least in the 7 figures, download the free ebook, Navigating Global Trade, 3 Insights for Leaders, at netsuite.com/102. That's netsuite.com/102.
Yeah. Is there a certain amount that like economists agree on or like correlates, or is it kind of, and if not, is there kind of a moral hazard where if people just get upset, we have more redistribution, but you could have too much redistribution or something, or
Well, okay, so the moral hazard isn't there because of the collective action problem. So I can get upset, but that doesn't make anything. Like I can get upset that like people are abandoning their rabbits after Easter. I can, go take a wiffle bat and start clobbering people in the marina, but I'm just going to get arrested. Nothing's going to happen. Like getting mad is not an individual. Society getting mad is not an individual decision, and hence there's no moral hazard because decisions are made at the level of the individual.
Got it.
So I'm not worried about that. But it would be nice if we had some sort of hard rule of thumb. Like when inequality gets to this level, then your country's in trouble. And people have tried to do that, right? They've tried to look at cross-country regressions. They tried to look at famous examples, historical examples of unrest, and say, when you get to this level, you're in trouble. Pull back.
Piketty tried to have some framework, right?
That's right.
What was it again? He said when
I think he focuses on the share of the 1%. The share of wealth owned by the 1% gets to some level, then you have some sort of internal chaos or something like that.
And he had this thing where like R is greater than G. I'm trying to remember what it was like.
R is greater than G. So R just means like the rate of return on assets, and G means the growth rate, which is the growth rate of income. So when basically what that meant was that when rich people's wealth goes up faster than poor people's ability to save money, then you have spiraling wealth inequality that never goes down. And the rich people get richer and richer and richer, and leave the poor behind because of all this wealth that they're generating.
Yeah. Going back to Milei for a second, how much did he benefit from favorable macro conditions and forbearance from the IMF/investors? If his approach under threat, is his approach under threat if commodity prices surge again or an election goes wrong?
Certainly, he benefited from forbearance by the IMF, but then the IMF is the IMF. They're always telling people to do austerity, and that's why lefties hate the IMF. But Milei did what the IMF wanted, and the IMF gave him what he wanted, which is forbearance. So that's just the question of, should the IMF have given him forbearance anyway without having to do any austerity? And should the IMF operate as a charity? No, it should not. And so if you know these people are going to default on their loans, you shouldn't lend to them. Like the IMF always lends to Pakistan because they've got nukes and Islamists. But then the IMF wasn't going to keep lending to Milei unless he did some sort of austerity thing. And nor should they lend to him. So in other words, you have external creditors, you appease the external creditors. That's an absolutely valid mechanism for improving your macroeconomic situation.
So when I was at the University of Michigan, as were you in a different capacity, hence the name Econ 102, I took a course that was like an international relations course that was outside the economic department, and the teacher was pretty leftist, and they were, not to say that means they were wrong, but they really didn't like the IMF. It was outside of the economics department, which is legit, and basically, I'm trying to remember basically had very strong critiques of the IMF and what they've done to Latin America countries. I mean, that's a very broad or vague assertion, but what is sort of the legacy of the IMF in terms of how it's contributed or sort of, ruined or negatively impacted other countries' economic growth? Is a negative interpretation warranted, or is it undeserved?
I have a very good answer to that, actually. Not a very good answer, but a very clear, succinct answer. You can decide for yourself if it's good. So my answer to that is there's two kinds of crises. There's a demand shortage, and there's a currency crisis, a crisis of external demand for assets. No one wants to buy your currency and your bonds and stuff. Most emerging market crises are currency crises. And in currency crises, austerity helps because it lowers expected future inflation. It convinces everyone the government is serious and builds confidence, blah, blah, blah. Foreign money comes back into the country and the currency doesn't crash. So in those cases, the IMF is actually right that austerity is what countries need to do. But there's a second kind of crisis, which is more of a Keynesian type of crisis, a demand shortage, where there's structural overcapacity. And so, for example, Korea in the 90s built 1 million factories, and the factories built a whole ton of stuff, and then they had a crash. And yes, their currency went down, but fundamentally it was because of a demand shortage slowing down their economy, because they just had all this excess supply that they built and people didn't want it, and prices crashed, and everybody pulled back out of fear. That's a traditional Keynesian crisis. That's a demand crisis. And that's not the kind of thing where you want austerity. You actually want the opposite of austerity. You want fiscal stimulus. So people criticize the IMF because the IMF basically forgot that Keynesianism works and forgot that fiscal stimulus was important.
Yeah.
And they were right to criticize it. But that said, the IMF's orthodox austerity prescriptions are still right in quite a number of cases.
And so were there certain countries that were particularly negatively affected by it, or is that kind of unfair?
Were the worst affected countries? That's hard to say. Maybe, I mean, Korea, but Korea like did bounce back. Malaysia was sort of interesting case. Actually, I think Malaysia, they made a mistake. They urged austerity when stimulus would have been right for Malaysia.
And what about Argentina?
Argentina, the IMF prescriptions have been right because
Got it.
Argentina is a commodity exporter, right? It's not suffering from structural overcapacity of manufactured goods. All right,
Yeah.
it's a commodity exporter. Argentina digs stuff out of the ground and sells that stuff. That's what they do for the world. They have farmland too. That's similar. Anyway, but then they overconsume.
Yeah.
They structurally overconsume by giving people too generous a welfare state, by all these consumer subsidies for various goods like gas. They're like, here, have cheap this, have cheap that. Like, that's not even redistribution. That's like redistribution to like high people who consume a lot of that stuff. So it's redistribution to the middle and even upper middle class. But it's just dumb, and they have too much of this. It costs them way too much money, and they don't pay for it with taxes. They pay for it with debt. And and the IMF is silly to lend them that money unless they do austerity. So that's why austerity was the right choice for Argentina. Milei did it, and now they're in better shape.
Yeah, that makes sense. Shifting to other countries you wrote about, Vietnam and Bangladesh, as more countries like this emerge, sort of copy parts of the Chinese industrial model, does U.S. risk becoming less relevant to global development since Chinese suppliers, companies, and technologies are driving a lot of the investment and growth in the poor world?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how much they're copying the Chinese model because Bangladesh has gone all in on government promotion of the garment industry. So Bangladesh is like, we make shirts, we make pants, we make shoes, and so that's honestly to the detriment of other industries that they probably should have been doing, like electronics assembly.
Hmm.
Vietnam has promoted FDI, and it's been much more agnostic about industries than Bangladesh, and has done some garment things, and it has done some other industries like electronics and stuff like that. It's a much more balanced growth path, and it's done a decent job educating people through high school. But Vietnam doesn't have higher education very good. So in Vietnam, not a lot of college kids. Maybe because they're scared college kids will like become a bunch of protesters and revolt, because that did happen in the past. I don't know. But the point is that Vietnam isn't very good at college, so it's not very good at research. So it's not very good at training a whole lot of super educated people to like absorb foreign technology and set up competitors to foreign stuff. What Vietnam should be doing is following the path of Korea. Vietnam should be making its own companies to like compete with the Chinese and the Taiwanese and the Japanese and whoever. But they're not doing it.
Why not?
Well, one reason is because nobody goes to college. Like, college is where you learn engineering, right? In America, we think of college as teaching you like a bunch of lefty bullshit, right? Or maybe economics. But like, in a lot of these developing industrializing countries, college is where you go to learn how to be an engineer. And if you don't have engineers, then you have people doing basic assembly line work en masse. But like, where are the indigenous people, the Vietnamese people who understand how to make these products at like a deep level?
And why aren't people going to college again?
I don't know. Vietnam has not promoted it, not made it a priority, blah, blah, blah. Their higher education system is weak. I do not know why that is true.
Interesting. You point to Bangladesh's garment boom and then its political unrest. Could the DACA have insulated growth from that volatility, or was mono export reliance always a trap?
It was always a trap. But it wasn't a trap that you need to get trapped in. Like, it was a pitfall, but it wasn't like, there's nothing wrong with promoting the garment industry for a while. What's wrong is when you don't add industry 2 and industry 3. And now what's happened with Bangladesh is largely orthogonal to whether that was a mistake, but it's political unrest. So you had Sheikh Hasina, who was this woman who had been like an independence leader in the 1973 war. She'd been like a big leader in Bangladeshi politics. And she basically was forced out by street protests and just rising anger. And now there's a lot more political uncertainty, instability as to who's going to control the country. So like, Islamists might control the country. It's not clear. She was very pro-Indian, and one reason that Bangladesh had such stability is because it was sort of allied with India. It's not, India supported her though, and the new government is more hostile to India. So it's not clear whether that will become a regional sore spot or like a source of stability once again. And so like, Bangladesh is having instability, and so investments pulling back, and Bangladesh's growth is slowing down.
Yeah. What should we take from the Vietnams and Bangladeshes of the world, like in the U.S.? Like if we wanted to take the best of the Chinese model, what would we be doing?
Well, so I think one thing we need to do is bank finance. I think that those countries have banks finance their manufacturers. I think that that's very effective in terms of long-term relationships, you know, understand investors understanding the sector. It's somewhat cheaper financing than the bond market, and it's much cheaper financing than equity. You know as well as anybody that equity is expensive, right? If you give away large chunks of your company to finance every round, you're soon going to not own your company at all.
Mhm.
Right? And so instead, what debt does is it allows you to basically keep the money for yourself as long as you pay the creditor back. And usually the interest rate is a lot lower than, you know, what you'd effectively be paying if you gave away all your equity. So debt is a cheaper way for a company to finance itself. One reason we can't do debt in America as well is because there's some sort of like minimum scale required for you to actually sell your bonds in the bond market. And even then you have to sell junk bonds, right? There's not as many investors who are interested in it. But in the days of bank loans to manufacturers, any manufacturer can just go to the bank and say like, hey, give me a loan. And then a lot of them don't, some of them do. But then it basically provides this big flow of capital so that manufacturers can buy their machines and scale up and all the other things manufacturers need to do. They need loans, right? And we're not doing it for them.
Yeah. And why don't we do that?
So the answer is I don't know, because I think making banks do stuff like that is interfering in the economy to some degree.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. In general, just reflecting on sort of these developing economies posts, where do you think that people have a big misperception or misunderstanding or don't fully appreciate about sort of economic development in general, as somebody who studies it closely?
What don't people appreciate? I think people don't appreciate when countries get rich. So, like Malaysia has gotten a standard of living that's not quite the same as what we enjoy in America, but is not poor. But a lot of Americans will just think of Malaysia, oh, some random country in Asia, and they have this idea of it as like some sort of like impoverished shithole. Well, it's not even close. It's like it's got housing developments that are like nicer than what we've got in a lot of ways. And it doesn't have as much retail, as much shopping, as many cars per person or whatever. But like economically, it's a nice place to live. And so people don't understand, or like Poland. People still think of Poland as like this old Soviet bloc or like, you know, Warsaw Pact, East European sort of shithole. Poland is now a rich country and it's growing fast. It's actually richer than Japan now. I think it's projected to be this year, richer than Japan.
Wow, fascinating. How is it doing that?
Well, I mean, good institutions and FDI. That's it. Just have property rights and finance and all that stuff and regulation that like works and is effective. And then tell everybody set up shop here and just facilitate every company in the world putting their factories and whatever in Poland.
And does Japan not have a ton of FDI?
No, Japan is very little, and that's what my book is about. Weeb Economy. It's about how Japan can sort of belatedly hop on this train.
And what are the main recommendations for them to get on the FDI train?
Well, just government promotion. I mean, they have to sell it, right? They have to say, here is a country where you can put your factory. Here is a
Yeah.
country where you can put your research center. Please build things here. Build things in Japan, and then just hold their hand, help them, you know, help them get a bank account, help them get places to live, help them get like visas for all their workers that they bring from overseas, help them get local talent, help them hire people, you know, just help them and roll out the red carpet, give them tax advantages, all kinds of things, make Japan one of the beating hearts of the global manufacturing economy.
Yeah.
An alternative to China.
Fascinating. By the way, have you appreciated how the book has been received, reviewed? Have people agreed with the
Yep.
claims? Any reflections on that?
Absolutely. It's been very popular. It's you know, books are a slow burn by nature. But yeah, no, it's doing pretty well, I think.
Cool. I want to segue to a couple of your other posts here. One is you wrote about tariffs and their impact on the economy, which hasn't been, it seems, a ton yet. And you reflect why perhaps that has been and you know what we could see. So why don't you sort of unpack what your perspective of sort of tariffs impact on the economy thus far?
Well, I wrote that post about inflation. Okay. And tariffs, we haven't seen a lot of inflation yet. We've seen in the most recent month, we saw slightly accelerating inflation. It's not clear how much inflation tariffs will bring. There's three things that mitigate tariffs' impact on inflation. The first one is just time. Like it takes time for these tariffs to show up in prices, and that's going to reduce the rate at which prices go up. That's going to reduce inflation. So that's a thing. So just time is a big deal. of course, eventually you run out of time and prices start getting forced up. The second thing is that companies can eat the cost. So whether it's your retailer, who decides to eat the cost at like Walmart or Amazon or whatever, decides to eat the cost of those tariffs, or whether it's the Chinese manufacturer who decides to eat those tariffs, companies have profit margins and they can reduce their profit margins. They have a cushion where they can absorb shocks like that to maintain sales volume. So how much cost they eat and how much cost they pass on to you is not clear ahead of time.
Yeah.
And so when Republicans see inflation not going up much immediately in response to tariffs, they immediately gravitate toward one explanation, which is that Chinese producers are eating the cost. And that may be true in the short term, but here's the thing. In the long term, so suppose that, Toyota sells a car in America, right? And suppose Toyota makes $2,000 of profit on every car. Now we put a tariff of $1,000 on Toyota cars. Now Toyota can reduce its profit margin from 2,000 to 1,000, but it's still worthwhile for them to make the same number of cars. And in fact, yeah, it's still worthwhile, right? They just reduce their price and just game on, right? They just make less profits, but they're still making profits, right? They're not going to pull out. But second scenario, remember in the scenario, Toyota initially makes $2,000 of profit per car. Suppose we put a tariff of $3,000 per car. Now, no matter what Toyota does, even if it slashes its prices, by $3,000, it can maintain market share, but it will take a financial loss on every car it sells. Or they can choose to exit the market. So if companies are eating these tariffs, it's a good chance that some of them are doing it by temporarily selling below cost once you factor tariffs into the cost. They're selling at a loss. And that can't last because nobody wants to keep loss-making divisions. So companies can eat the tariff for a while, and then the companies go away, and then Americans suddenly find that they're without TVs or something. So that can happen. And then there's a third thing that can happen, which is that tariffs can scare the country and make some loans go bad and contribute to deficient demand. Deficient demand slows down the real economy, increases unemployment, but also holds down inflation. So that could be going on as well. It's not good, but it could be restraining inflation.
Yeah. And do you expect it to rise in sort of the next few months or by the end of the year or unclear?
I think it will rise somewhat by the end of the year, but I don't know how big that rise will be.
Yeah.
Maybe a bit. I don't think we're going back to 2022 or something. But I think that a lot depends on the Fed. And so inflation could rise a lot more if Trump ends up pushing Powell out and replacing Powell with some yes man who will just cut interest rates to the bone. Then we're going to get accelerating inflation, and pretty fast, I think.
Do you think he's likely to replace Powell?
It's possible. He does lots of crazy stuff.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Ever feel like managing your business finances is a full-time job on top of your actual full-time job? Yeah, me too. That is, until I started using Found. Found is a business banking platform that lets you effortlessly track expenses, manage invoices, and prepare for taxes. You can even set aside money for different business goals and control spending with different virtual cards. I've saved so much money because Found helps me identify tax write-offs. And I saved so much time that I can now devote to chasing new opportunities and doing the work I enjoy. Oh, and by the way, other small businesses are loving Found too. This Found user said, "Found is going to save me so much headache. It makes everything so much easier. Expenses, income, profits, taxes, invoices even. And Found has 30,000 five-star reviews just like this." Open a Found account for free at found.com/econ102. Found is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services are provided by Piermont Bank, member FDIC. Don't put this one off. Join thousands of business owners who have streamlined their finances with Found. When I had Harley Finkelstein, Shopify's president, on the show, he said something that really hit home for me as an entrepreneur.
Shopify, we pray at the altar of small business and entrepreneurship. I do think there's a lot of people out there who have a thing in their life, but for some reason or another, usually because they either think they have no experience or it's too expensive or too complicated, they do not cross the chasm from aspiring entrepreneur to entrepreneur.
Making entrepreneurship more accessible, that's exactly what we're talking about. It's not about having the biggest team or the deepest pockets. It's about having the right tools that level the playing field. And that's exactly what Shopify does for entrepreneurs everywhere. The biggest advantage you can have as an entrepreneur isn't money, it's agility. And that means having systems that move as fast as you do. Shopify's point of sale system is a unified command center that brings together your in-store and online operations across up to 1,000 locations. Your competitive edge comes from making buying from you as effortless as possible. Imagine being able to guarantee that shopping is always convenient. Endless aisle, ship to customer, buy online, pickup in store, all made simpler so customers can shop how they want and staff have the tools to close the sale every time. And let's face it, acquiring new customers is expensive. With Shopify POS, you can keep shoppers coming back with personalized experiences and first-party data that give your marketing team a competitive edge. In fact, it's proven. Based on a report from EY, businesses on Shopify POS see real results, like 22% better total cost of ownership and benefits, equivalent to an 8.9% uplift in sales on average relative to the market set surveyed. As Harley said, the cost of failure has never been lower and the tools have never been better. Turn those what ifs into why nots and keep giving those big dreams the best shot with Shopify. Get all the big stuff for your small business right with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/momentofzen. Go to shopify.com/momentofzen. Shopify.com/momentofzen.
What do you think Powell's legacy will be? Is it how should we think about?
Probably different among different people. He's not a flamboyant figure, so he won't be remembered quite as much as like, Volcker or Greenspan. But I think that I believe he'll be remembered positively because although he waited a little bit too long to start raising interest rates after the, pandemic, he got his act together fairly quick, started raising interest rates and basically quelled the post-pandemic inflation. He defeated it. He and the other central bankers that coordinated their monetary policy around the world or followed the Fed's lead or whatever, they defeated it, I think. They were most of the reason the inflation went back down was them reestablishing credibility by raising interest rates and refusing to tolerate the high inflation that was going on. That was it.
You reflected on where could the next financial crisis come from? Why don't you share that thinking?
Right. So financial crises happen really when you have two things happen. The first thing is an asset price crash. Asset price crashes happen whether because of bubbles or other reasons, but then the asset price crash triggers a wave of non-performing losses. It could be non-performing loans. It could be like people who default on their mortgages, but it's just losses, financial losses at banks and shadow banks and other financial institutions. And then when the asset prices go down, they don't have enough of a cushion of assets to be able to lend money. So they stopped lending, companies stopped making stuff and performing services and whatever, and then a recession happens. So that's basically how, when we ask where's the next financial crisis, we want to look for an asset price that could go down, but we especially want to look for a giant pile of debt. Where are the debts building up in the system? Where could a drop in asset prices, which will eventually happen everywhere, right? Where could a drop in asset prices really hurt? I think we see a bunch of banks and shadow banks right now that are highly exposed to the debt of hyperscalers, of companies building data centers for the AI boom. If AI doesn't generate as much revenue, and these revenue expectations are very high because there's billions upon billions upon billions of dollars being plowed into these data centers. If those bets don't pan out, we're going to have a crash. And in fact, this will be very, very reminiscent of crashes we've had before. In the mid-1800s, we built tons and tons and tons and tons of railroads, more than we needed in the present, and you saw this giant crash in 1873 that actually depressed the economy to some degree for 10 years.
Wow.
It wasn't as severe as the Great Depression, but it was, just a persistent growth slowdown for 10 years. And it was worldwide, or at least in rich countries at the time. There's going to be a bust.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean AI will be a bust. It's just the Gartner cycle, right? Where you overinvest at first and then you have a bust. And then eventually like all the infrastructure that you built, which in this case is often like, things like model weights and model architectures and more about the software infrastructure than the hardware infrastructure, because GPUs, you'll have a bunch of GPUs sitting around. That's cool. But you'll have a lot of stuff sitting around, both hardware and software, I guess. And that will then AI applications that make real money will come in and build on top of that foundation. And the AI industry will be absolutely huge. But then I think we're going to have to go through that bust. I think the question is, will that take the financial system down with us? with it, right? So the dot-com bubble didn't really do much to the financial system because there wasn't much debt involved. Hyperscalers have taken on a lot more debt, or the people investing in data centers have taken on a lot more debt to build these data centers. So like Meta and those big companies, they're not actually borrowing in the bond market, they're borrowing from private equity credit, right? That's an oxymoron, but it's private credit, but it's done by a PE firm.
Hmm. And by the way, you wrote a blog post about this, and we've also discussed in the past, of course. You're more sanguine on AI as it relates to employment. I think both at the lower end and at the upper end. We need to have our friend Dario come back at some point for a deeper discussion. But anecdotally, we hear some CEOs say, "Hey, now I don't need to hire as many people." There are a lot of startups that are claiming to do, elements of customer support or sales or certain functions. Are you are you dubious that this is happening, or you think even if they're hiring fewer people than they were for the same roles, just more jobs in these companies or more startups will spring up that'll make up for it? Or how do we think about that?
Well, so what I think is that there's been this big panic over shitty job market for college graduates, and this is AI. Everybody's saying this is AI doing this. AI is replacing entry-level workers. So the first reason to be suspicious of this is that when we look at the aggregate employment statistics, it's not happening. Okay, like in terms, if you look at the percentage of people who have jobs, it's like not going down, right? Or percentage of young people who have jobs, it's not going down. And so people are still getting jobs. And so you're like, oh, but only this one subset of people is not getting jobs. College graduates, professional, white collar professionals, or people who coders, people with like technical CS degrees aren't getting jobs. And so you have to really cherry pick. You've got to say, okay, we think AI, these are specifically the kind of people that AI is going to replace. Those are the people who are not getting jobs. And people have been saying this. Derek Thompson suggested it. And then a lot of people like Kevin Roos just stated it as a fact. A lot of people stated it as fact. And then the data doesn't hold up. There was a group called Oxford Economics, a consultancy, that told everybody that this was happening and cited these unemployment numbers. But like, they're not some godlike authority just because they have economics in their name of their consultancy, right? So when you look at the actual numbers, the story doesn't hold up. Number one, the story is about very recent college grads. But if you look at the 20 through 24 age group or the 25 and over age group, there's no gap. The unemployment rate, gap between college graduates and non-college people who only went to high school, is the same. It hasn't even changed. So like you have to like really slice it very fine to find this effect, right?
Got
And it wasn't a thing that was happening, and everyone just sort of ran with it. And then not everyone, I mean, some people were pushing back against it. And then sort of the strength of the fear kept a lot of people from pushing back until like a month later, 2 months later. But eventually people looked at the data, they did the legwork, they started pushing back. John Byrne Murdoch and Martha Gimbel and Ernie Tedeschi and all these people started pushing back. And there was one angry guy at The Economist who really did this very well. He pushed back instantly. I don't even know the guy's name because The Economist doesn't publish like bylines. They don't publish people's names with articles. But this guy was like, look, man, look, bro, it's not happening. And they did a New York Fed survey in late 2024 where the New York Fed went around and asked companies like, is AI affecting your hiring decisions? And almost all companies were like, nope, not affecting your hiring decisions. That was important. And so Derek Thompson actually cited that, but like Kevin Roos didn't care. Kevin Roos called up some companies like, oh yeah, man, we're going to replace all these guys with AI, but you didn't. That's what you get for believing these hiring managers. I don't know.
And okay, got it. So we don't see it in the data. And are you kind of like still dubious that we will see it in the data at some point, or you're just saying, hey, maybe it happened, maybe it won't, but we just haven't seen it?
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe we'll see in the data. AI could replace people's jobs tomorrow.
But haven't seen it yet.
But we haven't seen it yet. And these people just walk around with this absolute certainty that that's what AI does, that it's a human remover. That's what AI is. It's a people remover, right? And we don't know that yet.
Yeah.
We don't know that it will be. We don't know that it won't be. We don't know that it will be. So people need to stop pretending they really know what AI does to our economy.
Yeah. Speaking of data, you reflected on why you used to be more dubious as of macro and more excited about micro, or more of a believer in micro, but reflected that maybe there's some changes over the last decade that make micro perhaps rise in status and macro fall. Why don't you share that.
So basically, the financial crisis convinced a lot of people that macro was bunk. At the same time, and this had been going on before that, micro was getting much, 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 much better for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons was actually a theoretical innovation. So game theory turns out to work really damn well, much better than general equilibrium theory. General equilibrium theory is a theory that insists on describing every piece of the economy in terms of describing the whole. So you can't know about the market for oranges without knowing about the market for electric cars or something. And it forces you to make a giant theory of everything. And giant theories of everything, you just can't get the data to prove or disprove them. And you can't fit them to the data, and they're too big and unwieldy. They have too many parameters to estimate, and they're necessarily oversimplifications, and they end up being a hubris. And this is why macro doesn't really work. One of many reasons why macro doesn't really work. But with micro, people are like, okay, instead, let's just model the isolated strategic interactions between these people, and then you can get a lot of good stuff. Honestly, you can do isolated modeling of the supply and demand of the market for oranges, and you can get a good model too. You can get pretty good modeling there. So at the same time, there was a technological empirical innovation where we got computers and the internet. Suddenly, huge amounts of data on economic behavior that we never had before. Reams and reams and reams and reams of data, huge supply of data, which created huge demand for economists to look at natural experiments, to look at things where, one thing changes a little bit, or a policy changes, or this one thing changes a little bit. And then, or there's a lottery for something, you can look at both sides of the lottery, or look at minimum wages and compare cities that raise their minimum wages to similar cities that didn't raise their minimum wages, or look at immigration surges and look at places that got immigrants versus places that didn't get immigrants, similar places that didn't get immigrants, let's say. And so then the reams of data we've been getting from the computer and internet revolution represent a humongous opportunity for empirical economics. And so everybody's been doing micro because these are micro empirics. Whereas macro, people were like chastened. People said, okay, this isn't working. At the same time as micro became much, 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 much easier and more fruitful to do and more powerful. And so because of those two things, people are switching from macro to micro.
Yeah, got it. Makes sense. The another fascinating thing you uncovered or were writing about was this idea of basically connection between, there's a drop in crime, and that leads to, less incarceration, which sort of intuitively makes sense. But the question I have is, to what do we have to credit the drop in crime?
I don't know. No idea. You mean the drop in crime in the last few years, not the
Yeah,
one
yeah,
in the 90s?
yeah.
I don't know. I know that a lot of places put a lot more police on the street. I know that unrest after the Floyd protests faded in a lot of places. I know that some cities experimented with a whole bunch of focused deterrence approaches, which is supposed to be an effective approach. We basically, most murders are of people who are themselves likely to murder. We're no longer in a world where, tough guys go out and just shoot innocent people on the street.
Yeah.
Or mug them and kill them, or just whatever. Murders between people who know each other, between people who are intimate partner violence has gone way down, or killing your spouse has gone way down. All these things, killing your friends. People kill, angry young guys kill rival angry young guys in poor neighborhoods. That's where America is at right now. That's what murder is. So if you go to those guys and say, you're going to die, son, unless you snitch and help us figure out who are the other people who are likely to die, we're just going to go to them and say, hey, bro, you're likely to die too. So then they just, keep everybody from dying by having them not fight. This actually turns out to work pretty well, and Baltimore's been using this to good effect. And I think it's not a depolicing strategy. It's simply using cops to go out and prevent crime before it happens instead of waiting until crime happens and punishing it after the fact.
Yeah. And is there any lesson from the 90s that is applicable, or was that
I think that a lot of these approaches started to get pioneered in the 90s, as did things like community policing, broken windows policing, all these other ideas started getting pioneered in the 90s because we had this big fight back against crime. And I think a lot of those are effective. If you just have police walk around in the neighborhood, give people a feeling of safety and security, it prevents crime. So I think you're starting to see a lot of that. And we learned lessons in the 90s that we can keep applying now.
Yeah, makes sense. And gearing towards closing here, just covering other topics you wrote about, I said provocatively, how do we maintain fertility rates while also continuing to educate more women, because there seems to be a trend where the more education women have, the fewer kids they want to have or end up having as a result of competing priorities.
So in poor countries, what you see is that when you teach girls to read, they stop having kids. And when you move people to the cities, they stop having kids.
And is that because of opportunity cost or because?
Yes, they know more about birth control, but also opportunity cost is a big deal. Your horizons expand, right? To reduce women's education enough to raise our own fertility rate, we would have to basically keep women literally illiterate.
Yeah.
So they could not even read the web. But even that's not going to work anymore because of TikTok. You
Yeah.
can be illiterate and you can understand TikTok. People tell you about birth control. People tell you about economic opportunities. Even if you had some dystopian society that forced women to be illiterate, they're going to watch TikTok. So you'd have to basically reorient society toward keeping women in a tiny little information bubble where they can't meet anyone else. And then we're a poor country. We're a poor agrarian, impoverished poor country, because the changes in our society required to keep women locked up in bubbles would make us insanely poor. I'm not willing to do that. Find some other way. I don't want to live in that society just because we think that is how the human race survives, right? And it will also only work for a generation, because after a generation, the lash of poverty will make people desperate to escape it, and the technologies still exist to rebuild industrial society and make modernity. And people are going to make different choices. They're not going to say, well, we tried that and it led to low fertility rates, and Elon complained about it on this technology that no longer exists. Can you imagine how cosmically dumb this would be?
Yeah. And here's a orthogonal question, which is, in a world where AI does what people think it's going to do and replace a lot of labor, how important is a higher population? Could we continue to grow the economy with far fewer people, or how do you think about AI and sort of population?
I don't know. I mean, if AI really can replace humans, then that will mitigate the economic damage from the losses of population.
Yeah.
Right? We'll be able to replace the humans, do more stuff. And there is some degree of capital labor substitutability even without AI. But maybe AI will increase it. Who knows, right? We won't need humans to operate the AI. So that could happen, and that could ease some of the economic pain.
What is your most bullish recommendation if we wanted to increase the fertility rate? What do you think is the
I don't know. I mean, I think to some degree you can pay people to have kids, and it is a thing we should do, and is a thing that works to a small extent. You can raise birth rates from extremely low to simply somewhat low. Okay, we could do that. I think some of the solution has to be technological. We need to basically create technologies that make it easy to take care of kids, so that parenthood doesn't mean this giant change in your life where you lose all the good things that you know from youth, right?
Right.
Where parenthood is great. It's great to be a parent. You have these kids and you don't have to spend a lot of effort raising them. Technological solutions, AI nannies, AI governesses. We can all live like British aristocrats and have someone else raise our kids, and it's a robot.
Yeah.
That's what I would do.
That's an inspiring note to end on. Noah, this was a great conversation, a good grab bag episode, as always. Until next time.
Until next time, sir.
Before we get to today's episode, please note, this information is for general educational purposes only and is not a recommendation to buy, hold, or sell any investment or financial product. Turpentine is an acquisition of A16Z Holdings LLC and is not a bank, investment advisor, or broker-dealer. This podcast includes paid promotional advertisements, and individuals and companies featured or advertised during this podcast are not endorsing AH Capital or any of its affiliates, including but not limited to A16Z Perennial Management LP. Similarly, Turpentine is not endorsing affiliates, individuals, or any entities featured on this podcast. All investments involve risk, including the possible loss of capital. Past performance is no guarantee of future results, and the opinions presented cannot be viewed as an indicator of future performance. Before making decisions with legal, tax, or accounting effects, you should consult appropriate professionals. Information is from sources deemed reliable on the date of publication, but Turpentine does not guarantee its accuracy.
Econ 102 is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen, In the Arena, The Cognitive Revolution, and more.
If you like what you hear, subscribe and leave us a review in the App Store. You can keep up with both of our Substacks for written analysis of the topics we cover in the show at noahopinion.substack.com and eriktorenberg.substack.com. Thanks for listening.